Hey folks, welcome to my talk on Measurement Matters, why challenges to assessing mental health problems pose a substantial barrier to clinical progress. My name is Eiko and I'll be talking for about 20 minutes today. You can find the slides at the link below. So I want to start with the Mars Climate Orbiter. In 1999, and after 286 days of traveling through the cold, dark space, the little lonely climate orbiter arrived at Mars to then crash into Mars. You might have heard about that. The reason is that a European group was calculating some of the metrics to get to Mars, and an American group was calculating some of the metrics to land on Mars. And they used different types of units, imperial versus proper European units. And well, that didn't go too well. And so in the end, there was a measurement problem there. The second example is a bridge that Germans and Swiss built across the Rhine a couple of years ago. And the way you do this is you build the bridge from both sides simultaneously. And when they ended up meeting in the middle of the bridge, the engineers saw that there was a height difference of about 54 centimeters, or I think about 21, 22 inches, because the Germans and the Swiss had measured height above sea level from two different areas. One is, I believe, in Geneva and the other in Amsterdam, which measure different heights of different seas. And yeah, another measurement problem that led to pretty considerable consequences there. This is an example in our discipline. If you ask people the simple question, yes, uncertain, and no, without any further information, more people will say yes than will say no. If you ask them how satisfied they are, again, without any prompt, you just ask them, click one of these four answers, the larger majority of people will say satisfied over the other three options. And finally, if you ask people for correct or false, again, without any prompt, the large majority will say correct rather than false. And this has been replicated independently in many studies across many countries over the years in psychology. Measurement is really weird, it turns out. So there are two consequences from this. The first one is that measurement is difficult. That pertains to sort of physical measurement, as in the case of engineering or spacecraft, but especially so if we want to assess people's internal states, personality, cognition, or mental health problems, which is the topic of my talk today. And the second point is that measurement really matters. Proper measurement is the foundation for science, for empirical sciences at least. And I don't think we pay sufficient attention to measurement. So my thesis for today, it's quite challenging to measure mental health. There are many problems such as lack of transparency, for example in clinical trial registrations, and questionable measurement practices such as outcome switching. That's a term I've been sort of championing together with Jessica Flake in recent publications. Then there's a lack of funding for measurement research, and many of us who do measurement research have been told many times by high-impact journals that measurement is not sexy to publish in, and that we should rather publish in some sort of low-impact measurement journals. But, well, measurement people know about these problems. It's not really us that need to be informed about them. It's more applied folks, I think, whom we want to reach with our research. Together, I think that these issues pose a fundamental and underappreciated barrier to clinical insights, and sort of we call all of this together the measurement-schmeasurement attitude of the field. And yeah, my talk today will try to highlight some of these problems. So we need to talk, folks. I'll talk about major depression today as an example for measurement in mental health. But many of these examples will apply to other cases of anxiety disorders and so forth. I choose depression because I know a little bit more about it than other disorders. It's very common, it's commonly studied, debilitating, and costly, so I think it's a good example. For those of you who don't know how we measure mental health, just one slide here. Usually we assess a bunch of symptoms using a certain scale or list. We add them to a sum score, and then we analyze this score either in its dichotomized version, 0, you're not sick, 1, you have a mental health problem, or in a dimensional version, where the number of points is the sort of severity of the problem that you have. And I'll go through 4 or 5 types of problems in this area. Here's a quote. "The appearance of yet another rating scale for measuring symptoms of depression may seem unnecessary, since there are so many already in existence and many of them have been used extensively." Now, if I teach this lecture in person, I always ask who wrote this, if anybody realizes where that quote is from. And it is actually from Hamilton's 1960 depression paper, in which he proposes the Hamilton rating scale, one of the most commonly used scales today, 60 years later. And already then there were many scales. Today there are even more, of course. A recent review of 30 depression trials, I believe in adolescents, identified 19 different primary outcome measures of depression severity. So pretty much every paper uses a different core outcome measure. And a review by Santor et al., I think 2008, identified over 280 depression scales developed and used in the last century. I would say 30 or 35 are commonly used today still. Researchers only use one scale per study. In clinical trials it's a few more, but in empirical research in general we use one depression scale to measure depression. And folks rarely provide a rationale why they use this particular scale. Folks then draw conclusions about depression rather than depression measured with a certain scale, and that relies on the crucial assumption that scales of depression are interchangeable. So here's a bit of research we did a few years ago, where we summarized the overlap of the content of 7 what I consider to be the most commonly used rating scales for depression. The BDI, for example, in orange, the Back Depression Inventory, or in yellow, the Hamilton rating scale. I'm not going to go into the empty versus filled dots here, that's a complication. But overall, the content overlap was low, lower than even I expected. On the right-hand side, for example, you see all the green dots all by themselves. That means that they only appear in one rating scale, the CESD, and in none of the other rating scales. And overall, 40% of these symptoms appeared only in one single scale, and only 12% across all the instruments for measuring depression. In conclusion, there is a fundamental lack of agreement on sort of theoretically conceptualizing depression and measuring depression, based on what I've shown you now, but also based on the literature that many folks in the symposium will know quite well. Knowledge about depression is based on studies, at least outside of the clinical trial literature, that used one specific scale, given that many scales are only moderately correlated and feature different content. There's a big threat to replicability and generalizability of depression research. What you find in one scale might well not replicate in another scale. When you look at the most commonly used scales that I summarized above, not a single one adhered to the DSM criteria when suggesting probable diagnoses. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, but it is a little odd that this is considered the gold standard, but the commonly used measures do not adhere to the gold standard in suggesting probable diagnoses in, for example, psychological or epidemiological studies. And finally, I think this can be exploited through something akin to questionable measurement practices. For example, some depression symptoms like insomnia or loss of libido or potentially even suicidal ideation may result as side effects of antidepressants. And if you study antidepressants from a perspective of folks, for example, who want to sell a specific drug, then you may want to avoid such a scale because the efficacy of antidepressants might not be as large as using other scales that don't feature symptoms/side effects in your measurement. Not saying it is being exploited, but there are concerns here. The second point is the heterogeneity. And even if we ignore all the issues of the scales above and only go to the sort of gold standard, the DSM-5, and look at the 9 symptoms for depression in the DSM, you can see that 8 of these symptoms feature "or" in their description, such as increase or decrease in weight or appetite. And again, you need to indicate yes or no to that question. 3 of these questions are in fact opposites, such as loss of sleep or too much sleep, and this leads to at least theoretically over 10,000 unique ways in which people can meet criteria for major depressive disorder. So you could potentially see over 10,000 patients and never get a single patient who overlaps in their symptoms entirely with any of the other patients you see. Now that's hypothetical. How does it look in practice? We looked at the unique symptom profiles. So a symptom profile that only one person has in about 3,500 outpatients from the STAR-D study. And we found that about 50% of the profiles are endorsed by only a single individual. And we identified numerous outcomes. Overall, there were over 1,000 unique symptom profiles. Conclusion, there are pronounced differences between depressed patients, not only in terms of their symptoms, but also, of course, in other aspects we didn't talk about right now, etiology, disease course, treatment response, and so forth. And given other research I haven't shown, showing that particular depression symptoms like sad mood versus concentration problems are very differently impairing. Some symptoms impair more than others. Sort of summing up everything to a sum score may not be very informative when it is meant to reflect severity. In other words, 14 points on the Hamilton scale for Susan and 14 points for Bob may mean very different things, which is a fundamental issue of measurement. Third topic is scale quality. 3 most commonly used scales for depression today were developed in 1960, 61, and 77. I'm going based on citations here. These papers and the respective scales do not meet even the most basic criteria for scale validation studies. Jessica Flake, in her 2017 paper, has a really nice table 1, in which she summarizes sort of criteria for validation papers. And the overall psychometric quality of all of these depression scales is very poor. And of course, that's not surprising because they were not made by people who have a degree in developing scales. They're pretty much, they're based on clinical wisdom to some degree, but for example, 1960 and 1961, Hamilton and Beck had very fundamentally different ideas of what depression is. And so they, added different symptoms into their scales. And from that perspective, these scales are not too different from a BuzzFeed quiz where you just add a couple of items and write them down yourself, depending on your interest in what you want to measure. But that's not how we measure things in psychology. That's not a proper way to doing it. Just to give you one example here, this is a nice review paper by Bagby on the Hamilton rating scale that shows the exceptionally poor quality this scale has. I'm not going to go into the details here. You can find more information in that paper. Depression scales also lack unidimensionality and temporal measurement invariance, or MI. This is quite important. Unidimensionality means that the scale measures one construct, not 3 or 5. And if you use a PCA or a factor analysis, you will find that most depression scales in most populations have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 factors or components. And temporal measurement invariant means that you measure the same construct in the same people across time. And there's some strong evidence that suggests that neither of these assumptions hold in common data sets for depression, which is a fundamental measurement problem. Here's just a brief example of the STAR-D data. This is the Hamilton rating scale. And all I did is I visualized the correlations as a network. Green are positive correlations, red negative, and thick edges are stronger correlations. And you can see that the 17th item here has negative correlations predominantly. Some of them are pretty strong to other items. That's pretty crazy because this item is not meant to be recoded. You're just adding up these 17 items, although the 17th item is negative related to the other items. Like any basic correlational analysis would have shown this. But of course, the original paper by Hamilton had, I think, 20 or 25 patients, which is just not enough to establish validity for any scale. So the overall psychometric quality is low. People universally use some scores for depression when the underlying construct is multidimensional, at least in most of these scales. Even in the short ones, you find 2 factors often. And the scales are often not used as intended today. Hamilton, for example, wrote in his 60 paper Depression scale has been devised for use only on patients already diagnosed, and in fact Hamilton worked with very severe inpatients and who were already diagnosed with depression, and all he wanted to do is distinguish between the severe patients and the only severe patients, basically. But that's not how the scale is used today. People use the scale to enroll people into clinical trials, or not to enroll them if they don't meet the criteria. Fourth is lack of transparency or questionable measurement practices. My student Linus just finished his thesis that I graded last week, in which he drew 100 papers from clinical journals randomly with the criteria that they feature depression as an outcome and that they measure depression using the Hamilton scale. And 40% of these papers, 40 out of 100, did not provide any information on the version of the Hamilton used. And that's a big problem because it exists in dozens of languages and as 1, 3, 6, 8, 9, 11, 16, 17, 21, 24, 31, and 36 item versions. So we really need to know what version people used, and we often don't get that information. And only 8% provided any justification for choosing the Hamilton over the Beck or many of the other scales, which, it comes down to a lack of transparency. Reliability of depression is very low. This is a copy, the table from the 2013 paper of the DSM-5 field trials, in which they send patients to hundreds or thousands of patients, 2 clinicians each who were blinded and who independently diagnosed patients in the study. And for depression, the inter-rater reliability was 0.28, which is of course absolutely abysmal. You couldn't publish any paper on any construct with that sort of inter-rater reliability. And just to compare that to one of the more contentious disorders in psychiatry, borderline personality disorder, where the pooled summary was not quite twice as high, but substantially larger. Depression in this study was one of the low, I think among the 5 lowest of 50 or so reliabilities. And of course, that's not a situation we want to be on, because the decision whether you diagnose somebody has massive impact on their life. It comes with stigma, it comes potentially with pharmacological treatment, it may come with hospitalization. And if 2 clinicians more often disagree than agree with each other if somebody has depression, we have a huge measurement problem. Just to show you the problem here, on the left hand, I simulate the ground truth. So I have 100 patients or 100 people. 0 green means they don't have depression. 1 orange means they have depression. And now I simply simulate data from that for 2 clinicians with an inter-rater reliability of about 0.28, as in the DSM-5 field trial. And all the red fields are cases or people where the 2 clinicians will not agree with each other whether a person has depression. And that's really quite remarkable. Finally, a summary of the points I raised before. Knowledge about depression is largely based on studies with one specific scale, less so for the clinical trial literature, although I personally believe that is not for the right reasons of robustness and sensitivity. It's mostly for giving them an opportunity to selectively choose scales for which certain things work. But that's a topic for another discussion. The use of one scale is highly problematic because many scales exist. They differ quite a bit in content, are only moderately related with each other, and what you find in one scale may well not replicate in another scale, and there are plenty of examples in the published literature where this is the case. And that means we can only draw conclusions about depression measured via X rather than depression in empirical papers unless I see evidence that this generalizes across measures. As a third problem, most commonly used scales are over half a century old, around the time of the moon landing, and the DSM criteria for depression are equally old. They only have been slightly updated since the 50s when the finer criteria were published. And so I have to say that what we measure today has very little to do with sort of psychometric or even clinical evidence, and is mostly based on the opinion of a few sort of old white dudes in the 50s and 60s. And that is a weird state of psychiatry and clinical psychology to be in today. And finally, most of these scales, including the DSM criteria, lack basic psychometric properties, such as unidimensionality and measurement invariance. This has some consequences for what I think about depression as a construct, which sort of go beyond the talk today. But I think all of these pose considerable barriers to measurement of depression specifically, and many of these problems generalize to other mental health conditions. Conclusion: when you Google psychological measurement or psychological evaluation on Wikipedia, you get a warning that the article needs attention from an expert in psychology, and I couldn't agree more. I think measurement of mental health problems requires considerable effort in the future, of course, not only from psychology. And it's the basis, the foundation of empirical work, and we need to take the topic more seriously. Recently, the NIH and the Wellcome Trust in the UK have published a guideline that says that if you want to get funding from the NIH and the Wellcome Trust in the future, you are required to use a specific set of measures. So they sort of mandated particular measures for mental health. For depression in specific, they mandated the PHQ-9, which is very close to the DSM criteria. At first, I thought mandating specific measures would be a good idea, because then we would sort of remove all the heterogeneity from the literature. But when I talked about the proposal in more detail with Pravita Patalai, also based in the UK, we came up with quite a few problems of mandating mental health measures, and we discussed these in a short paper that we call Unintended Negative Consequences of Mandating Standardized Mental Health Measurement. I can't go into these problems in detail here, but if anybody's interested, there's a link in here. Yeah, I don't think that's the solution, given that the scale that they chose, the Wellcome Trust and the NIH, is not a very good scale, and sort of chosen on largely arbitrary reasons, and I think will sort of impoverish the world of mental health measurement, especially for depression. Solutions that I do see, and I put some papers down there in case anybody's interested in further ideas. I think we need to fund and publish measurement research in good journals with proper money. It's not just an adjunct or something that is not that important. Again, measurement is the foundation, and we need to do better. We need to embrace the fact as well that scale validation is an ongoing process that can take a decade or two before you have a good scale. The sort of way the publishing industry works in our field, or has historically worked, is that you write a paper and the paper cannot be changed anymore, and that's your scale. That makes no sense anymore today, where we could technically have hundreds of versions of the same scale. You could upload your scale online, you could change it whenever you perform changes, you could have a sort of version history for your scale. There's no reason not to do that. Jessica Flake and colleagues have a great paper, 2017, on scale validation that contains a lot of information how to get a valid scale and all the criteria that are required for that. The third point is that, as the discussant of our symposium today said, strong theories require strong constructs. And that means it takes theoretical work on mental disorders, and we should take that more seriously, for example, by building formalized computational models. And finally, and again, I've been working on this with Jessica Flake, avoid questionable measurement practices. Don't be questionable, be transparent, tell us what scale you used exactly and why you used that particular scale. And I think that'll be helpful for moving on in the future. Thanks for your attention. And I'm looking forward to the other talks in this symposium.